North Atlantic, March 1943. 200 miles southwest of Iceland. The convoy moved through darkness at 8 knots, 37 merchant ships arranged in 9 columns. Aboard the Liberty ship SS Thomas Hartley, ship's cook Harold Berkowitz stood in the galley at 0300 hours, unable to sleep. He'd survived 2 sinkings in 18 months. Tonight, something gnawed at him. During his last sinking 5 months prior, he'd spent 4 hours in a lifeboat listening to a U-boat's diesel engines prowl through the wreckage. The submarine circled, hunting for survivors with hydrophones, listening for voices, for splashing, for any sound. Berkowitz and 7 other men stayed absolutely silent while the U-boat's screws churned past 3 times. It eventually departed. 4 men died from exposure before rescue came 30 hours later. That experience taught Berkowitz about sound, about what traveled through water, about what predators listened for. Now he thought about the noises his galley created: metal pans clanging, coal scuttles scraping, pots hanging from overhead racks, swaying with the ship's motion, occasionally touching with soft metallic rings. Inside the hull, these seemed insignificant. But what did they sound like to a hydrophone operator 200 meters below? He'd mentioned this to the chief steward. The response was dismissive. "Engines make more noise than your pots, Berkowitz." The executive officer was only slightly more polite. "We have protocols for noise discipline. They're adequate. But protocols focused on machinery. Nobody considered the galley a tactical liability. Nobody except a cook who'd heard U-boat hydrophones from a lifeboat. The innovation Berkowitz was about to propose would be dismissed as paranoid and impractical by every officer aboard. It would violate merchant marine traditions. It would require exhausted crews to change routines. And within 6 weeks, it would become standard practice across Atlantic convoys after one particular incident proved that what happened in a galley could mean the difference between reaching Liverpool and dying in the North Atlantic. Understanding Berkowitz's insight requires understanding how U-boats hunted in 1943. The Kriegsmarine's Type 7C U-boat carried sophisticated passive sonar. The group on Horkadret, called GHG for short, consisted of hydrophones mounted in the submarine's bow, capable of detecting propeller noise at ranges exceeding 20 kilometers under ideal conditions. The system didn't emit signals, it simply listened. A skilled operator could identify not just the presence of ships, but their number, speed, and approximate size based purely on acoustic signatures. U-boat commanders used this capability with other intelligence. Enigma encrypted radio traffic coordinated wolfpack positions based on convoy routes. Aircraft reconnaissance provided occasional visual confirmation. Radio direction finding tracked transmissions from convoy escorts. But the most reliable method, the one that worked in all weather conditions, day or night, was hydrophone detection. The process was methodical. U-boats deployed in patrol lines across predicted convoy routes. Each submarine maintained positions submerged during daylight to avoid aircraft. Hydrophone operators monitored continuously through headphones connected to the GHG array. When they detected distant propeller sounds, the submarine adjusted course toward the source, refining position through successive bearings. The convoy, unaware of detection, continued on its plotted course. This gave U-boat commanders critical advantages. They knew convoy composition before visual contact. They could position ahead and wait in ambush. They could coordinate with other submarines in the Wolfpack. The convoy had no indication it had been compromised until torpedoes entered the water. Allied countermeasures in March 1943 included evasive routing, escort vessels with ASDIC sonar, radar-equipped aircraft, and high-frequency direction-finding equipment called Huff-Duff that tracked U-boat radio transmissions. These measures helped. Convoy losses had declined from the catastrophic rates of 1942. But U-boats continued sinking merchant ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. The fundamental problem remained acoustic detection. Convoys couldn't hide their propeller noise. 37 merchant ships, each turning screws through water, created unmistakable sound signatures. Even the quietest diesel freighter generated cavitation, the formation of bubbles around propeller blades that collapsed with distinctive acoustic patterns. These sounds propagated through water far more efficiently than through air. A convoy invisible in fog or darkness still announced its presence acoustically to any submarine with hydrophones. Naval architects understood this. Warship designers incorporated noise reduction features in destroyers and submarines. Rubber mountings isolated machinery from hull structures. Propeller designs minimized cavitation. Crews received training in acoustic discipline. But merchant ships, built for cargo capacity and construction speed, incorporated no such refinements. Liberty ships were welded together in an average of 42 days. Sound dampening wasn't a priority when shipyards were launching 3 vessels per day. This created the acoustic environment Berkowitz lived within. The Thomas Hartley, like every merchant ship in the convoy, generated continuous noise from propulsion machinery, auxiliary systems, cargo shifting in holds, hull flexing in heavy seas, and crew operations. The cumulative effect made the convoy audible to hydrophones at ranges that depended on water conditions. In the North Atlantic during March, with surface temperatures near freezing and minimal thermocline layers, sound carried exceptionally well. Detection ranges for a convoy this size likely reached 15 to 20 kilometers. Berkowitz understood none of the technical details. He'd never seen a submarine's hydrophone system. He didn't know the term cavitation or the physics of acoustic propagation. But he understood, from 4 hours in a lifeboat, that U-boats hunted by listening. And he understood that his galley made noise. The insight that led to his proposal came during conversation with machinist's mate Vincent Castellano, who'd served on destroyers before transferring to merchant service. Castellano explained how warships maintained noise discipline. Everything gets padded. Tools secured in felt-lined boxes. Hatches with rubber seals. Even mess kits aren't metal. Compressed fiber doesn't clang. "What about cooking?" Berkowitz asked. "Submarine crews eat cold rations when running silent. Surface ships depends on tactical situation. If you're hunting or being hunted, galley secures all metal implements. Use wooden spoons, ceramic bowls, anything that doesn't ring." Berkowitz considered this. "How much difference does it make?" Castellano shrugged. "Destroyers worry about it because we're trying to sneak up on submarines. For a merchant ship in convoy, honestly, your propeller's going to give you away long before your cooking pots matter." That answer satisfied most questions. But it didn't satisfy Berkowitz's specific concern, which wasn't about a single ship's galley, but about 37 galleys operating simultaneously across a convoy formation. He began paying attention to timing of galley operations throughout the convoy. Merchant ships maintained similar watch schedules. Crews changed at 0400, 0800, 1200, 1600, 2000, and midnight. Galleys prepared meals on corresponding schedules, coordinated to have food ready when crews came off watch. This meant that at certain times, multiple ships conducted identical operations. Coal scuttles scraping, pots clanging, stove grates lifting. The sounds synchronized across the formation. To someone inside a ship, this seemed irrelevant. But to a hydrophone operator listening from below, these synchronized sounds might create acoustic patterns that helped identify convoy composition and structure. They might reveal how many ships were present. They might indicate the convoy's organization. They might help a U-boat commander determine optimal attack position. Berkowitz couldn't prove this. He had no technical training. He simply had intuition born from hearing a U-boat hunt. His proposal, when he finally committed it to paper and submitted it through the chief steward to the executive officer, was straightforward. Randomize galley operations across the convoy. Instead of every ship preparing meals on synchronized schedules, stagger the timing. coordinate through the Convoy Commodore's office to ensure each vessel operated on different schedules, breaking the acoustic pattern. Additionally, implement noise discipline measures in galleys. Pad metal surfaces. Secure loose implements. Eliminate unnecessary sounds during hours when U-boat detection risk was highest. The executive officer's response, delivered by the chief steward, was brief. Request denied. Current meal schedules are established for crew welfare and operational efficiency. Changes would create confusion without meaningful tactical benefit. Matter is closed. Berkowitz accepted this. He was a cook, not a tactician. He'd made his suggestion. If officers with naval training disagreed, presumably they knew better. Then, on March 18, 1943, Convoy HX-227 ran into Wolfpack Robgraph, and the underwater war revealed exactly how sophisticated U-boat hydrophone operations had become. Convoy HX-227 departed New York on March 1, 1943, carrying 40 merchant ships loaded with war materials bound for Liverpool. The crossing proceeded without incident for 14 days. Evasive routing kept the convoy north of known U-boat patrol lines. Weather remained rough but manageable. 2 ships dropped behind with mechanical problems but later rejoined. On March 13th, German B-Dienst signals intelligence intercepted and decrypted Allied routing messages. The information reached U-boat headquarters in Paris, where Admiral Karl Dönitz personally coordinated Wolfpack deployments. Dönitz assigned 11 submarines from Grupp Robgraph to intercept HX-227. The boats formed a patrol line across the convoy's projected path, spacing themselves 20 kilometers apart in a north-south barrier 280 kilometers long. First contact came on March 18th at 1400 hours. U-boat 528, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Georg Hartwich, detected propeller sounds on hydrophones while submerged at periscope depth. Initial bearing was vague, but successive readings confirmed a large formation approaching from the southwest. Hartwich surfaced briefly to transmit a contact report, then submerged again to track the convoy's movement. Within 2 hours, 5 additional U-boats had received position updates and were converging. Weather deteriorated, with heavy cloud cover preventing air support from reaching the convoy. Escort vessels, 4 destroyers and 6 corvettes, moved to defensive positions, but the number of submarines exceeded the escort's ability to screen the entire formation. The attack commenced after dark. U-528 fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at 0230 hours on March 19th, hitting 2 merchant ships. Both vessels, loaded with ammunition and aviation fuel, exploded catastrophically. The convoy executed an emergency turn to starboard, while escorts dropped depth charges and fired star shells to illuminate the surface. 2 more U-boats attacked from different bearings over the next 30 minutes, sinking 3 additional ships. The convoy scattered, abandoning formation to make individual evasive maneuvers. This was precisely what Wolfpack tactics aimed to achieve. Scattered ships became isolated targets. Over the next 2 days, U-boats operating individually picked off stragglers. By March 21st, when surviving merchant ships finally came under air cover from Iceland-based aircraft, 11 vessels had been sunk. Over 600 merchant sailors and naval personnel died. The cargo loss included 12,000 tons of fuel, 7,000 tons of ammunition, 1,500 tons of food supplies, and 48 aircraft being shipped as deck cargo. The battle for Convoy HX-227 represented exactly the kind of coordinated Wolfpack operation that was bleeding the Atlantic shipping lanes. Dönitz considered it a significant success. Allied command recognized it as a crisis point. If U-boat effectiveness continued at this level, the Atlantic supply line would fail before sufficient countermeasures could be deployed. What made the attack particularly concerning was the precision of initial detection. Hartwich's hydrophone contact had identified convoy composition and formation structure before any visual confirmation. His after-action report, later recovered from German archives, included detailed acoustic analysis. He'd counted between 38 and 42 ships based on propeller sounds. He'd identified at least 4 escort vessels from their higher speed signatures, and he'd noted synchronized auxiliary sounds suggesting routine watch changes and meal preparation across formation. That final detail went largely unnoticed in Allied analysis of the battle. Intelligence officers focused on wolfpack coordination effectiveness, inadequacy of escort numbers, and vulnerability created by gaps in air coverage. Nobody examined the phrase synchronized auxiliary sounds. Nobody except Harold Berkowitz, who read about the battle in a bulletin distributed to merchant ships 2 weeks later. The bulletin, issued by the Admiralty, summarized recent convoy actions and provided updated tactical guidance. The section on HX-227 described the attack sequence and listed lessons learned. Most recommendations focused on escort tactics and aircraft coordination, but one line buried in technical notes caught Berkowitz's attention. Enemy contact reports suggest sophisticated acoustic analysis of convoy patterns and operations. Berkowitz showed this to Castellano. That's what I was talking about. They're listening to more than just engines. Castellano read the bulletin carefully. Maybe, but how would you prove it? And even if you could, what's the solution? You can't stop cooking. Crews need hot food. You don't stop cooking. You stop doing it all at the same time. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. These are the stories that don't make it into standard histories of the Battle of the Atlantic. Berkowitz revised his proposal. This version included specific reference to the HX-227 battle and the Admiralty's own technical notes about acoustic analysis. He detailed exactly how galley operations could be staggered without reducing meal quality or crew welfare. He suggested that each ship in a convoy receive randomized schedule assignments, coordinated by the convoy commodore, creating acoustic irregularity instead of synchronized patterns. He proposed simple noise reduction measures, foam rubber padding for galley surfaces, fabric wrapping for utensils, anything to dampen metal-on-metal contact. He submitted this through official channels on April 10, 1943. The chief steward forwarded it with mild endorsement. The executive officer, to Berkowitz's surprise, passed it up to the ship's master, Captain Eugene Threlkeld, with a notation that while unusual, this proposal demonstrates initiative and may warrant technical evaluation. Threlkeld was a 38-year veteran of merchant service who'd survived 3 sinkings in 2 years. He read Berkowitz's proposal twice, then called the cook to his cabin. "You understand," Threlkeld said, "that changing meal schedules affects crew morale. Men expect hot food at certain times. It's one of the few comforts they have out here." "Yes, sir, but they'd still get hot food. Just not all at the same time across the convoy. Each ship would have its own schedule. And you think this would actually reduce U-boat detection effectiveness?" "I think it's worth trying, sir." "Worst case, it does nothing, and we go back to normal schedules. Best case, it makes us harder to track." Threlkeld considered this. "The challenge is testing it. We can't measure whether U-boats detect us differently. We only know if we get torpedoed or don't, and that depends on dozens of variables." "True, sir, but the Admiralty's own bulletin says U-boats are doing acoustic analysis of our patterns. If we break those patterns, it should create uncertainty for them." Threlkeld made no immediate decision. Instead, he drafted a message to the convoy commodore, Rear Admiral Edmund Vogel, outlining Berkowitz's proposal and requesting consideration for implementation on an experimental basis. Vogel, sailing aboard the lead ship, responded within 6 hours. The response was cautious but not dismissive. Vogel noted that acoustic discipline measures were already standard on warships and that extending similar concepts to merchant vessels merits evaluation, provided implementation does not compromise operational efficiency or crew welfare. He authorized a limited trial. 5 ships in the convoy, including the Thomas Hartley, would implement randomized galley schedules and basic noise reduction measures for the remainder of the crossing. Results would be assessed at Liverpool. Berkowitz had 4 days to prepare. He coordinated with galley crews on participating ships through signal lamp messages after dark, when visual communication wouldn't create radio transmissions that U-boats could track. Each ship received a randomized meal schedule, staggered so that no 2 vessels operated identically. They agreed on noise reduction protocols: metal implements wrapped in cloth, pot racks secured with fabric padding, coal handling conducted with deliberate care to minimize scraping sounds, stove operations conducted with attention to reducing metallic clanging. The measures felt absurd to most participants. Galley crews complained about extra effort. Some officers regarded the entire exercise as superstitious nonsense, equivalent to believing that painting a ship's funnel a certain color would ward off torpedoes. But Vogel had authorized it, so they complied. The convoy continued toward Liverpool. U-boat activity in the area remained high. Intelligence reports indicated wolfpack formations operating along the projected route. Escort vessels maintained maximum vigilance. Aircraft patrols, when weather permitted, provided overhead coverage. The convoy executed several emergency turns in response to possible submarine contacts. No attacks occurred during the final 7 days of the crossing. All 37 ships reached Liverpool on April 28, 1943. This proved nothing. Convoys frequently crossed without attack due to successful evasive routing, effective escort work, or simply because U-boats were deployed elsewhere. There was no way to determine whether galley noise discipline had contributed to the safe passage. But 2 weeks later, a decrypted German message changed that assessment completely. The British government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park had been breaking German Enigma encryption since 1940, providing intelligence that Allied command classified as ultra, the highest secrecy level. By 1943, cryptanalysts were regularly decrypting U-boat radio traffic, though often with time delays that limited tactical applications. On May 12, 1943, Bletchley Park decrypted a message originally transmitted on April 26 from U-boat 381 to headquarters in Paris. The submarine's commander, Oberleutnant Zersay Wilhelm Kessler, was reporting on patrol operations in the North Atlantic. Most of the message covered standard details: position updates, fuel status, torpedo inventory, weather observations. One section, however, described an unusual hydrophone contact. Kessler reported detecting what appeared to be a large convoy on April 22, but acoustic analysis produced irregular patterns inconsistent with standard formation operations. His hydrophone operator, an experienced petty officer named Oskar Fleischer, had noted that auxiliary sounds typically synchronized across convoy formations were absent or randomized, suggesting possible acoustic deception measures or unusual composition. Kessler had attempted to close for visual confirmation, but escort activity forced him to break contact. He'd surfaced after dark to transmit a position report, but by the time other Wolfpack boats arrived, the convoy had altered course. No attack developed. Kessler's message concluded with a recommendation that headquarters evaluate whether enemy convoys are implementing acoustic discipline protocols similar to those employed by warships. This decrypt landed on the desk of Commander Roger Thornton, a Royal Navy officer assigned to Admiralty Tactical Analysis. Thornton's job involved correlating ultra-intelligence with known convoy operations to assess patterns and develop countermeasures. He immediately recognized the significance. The convoy Kessler had detected on April 22 matched the position and timing of the formation that included the Thomas Hartley. The irregular patterns, the U-boat reported, corresponded exactly with the experimental galley schedule randomization. Thornton drafted an urgent assessment. His analysis noted that U-boat hydrophone operators were sophisticated enough to detect not just primary propulsion sounds, but also secondary acoustic signatures from routine shipboard operations. The fact that Kessler had specifically noted the absence of synchronized auxiliary sounds confirmed that such sounds normally contributed to U-boat targeting. The implementation of randomized schedules had apparently created sufficient acoustic irregularity to confuse the detection process. This intelligence couldn't be shared widely without risking German awareness that Enigma was compromised, but it could inform policy changes. Thornton recommended that acoustic discipline measures, including randomized operational schedules and galley noise reduction, be implemented across Atlantic convoy operations under the guise of routine tactical evolution rather than specific intelligence. The recommendation moved through Admiralty channels quickly. On May 26, 1943, the Admiralty issued Tactical Memorandum 47/43 to all convoy commodores and merchant shipmasters. The document described enhanced acoustic discipline protocols and mandated specific measures. First, galley operations would be randomized across convoy formations. Each ship would receive individual meal preparation schedules, coordinated to avoid synchronized activities. Second, noise reduction measures would be implemented in all auxiliary operations. Metal equipment would be padded, tools secured, unnecessary sounds eliminated during high-risk periods. Third, crew training would emphasize acoustic discipline as equivalent in importance to light discipline and radio silence. The memorandum presented these measures as tactical innovations developed through operational analysis. It made no reference to ultra-intelligence. It did not mention Harold Berkowitz or the experimental trial aboard the Thomas Hartley. From the perspective of most merchant sailors, these were simply new regulations from command, another set of procedures in an already complex operational environment. Implementation varied across the merchant fleet. Some ships complied meticulously. Others treated the regulations as bureaucratic nuisance, implementing minimal changes. Galley crews, already overworked, resented additional protocols. Officers questioned whether the effort produced meaningful results. The measures remained controversial throughout summer 1943. Then the statistics began shifting. Assessing acoustic discipline effectiveness required careful analysis because convoy survival depended on multiple overlapping factors. Increased escort numbers, improved radar, long-range aircraft, better ASDIC equipment, tactical evolution, routing intelligence, all these elements influenced U-boat success rates. Isolating the contribution of any single measure was nearly impossible. But patterns emerged in after-action reports and intelligence assessments during summer and autumn 1943. U-boat contact reports, when decrypted, increasingly mentioned difficulty achieving positive identification of convoy compositions. Multiple messages described hydrophone contacts that failed to develop into attacks because submarines couldn't determine formation size or structure with confidence. Commanders reported atypical acoustic signatures and irregular operational patterns that complicated targeting solutions. Convoy commodores, in their post-voyage reports, noted that U-boat attacks seemed less coordinated than earlier in the year. Wolfpack formations still engaged convoys, but precision of initial positioning appeared degraded. Submarines seemed less certain about convoy composition before committing to attacks. Operational research analysts at Western Approaches Command in Liverpool conducted systematic review of convoy operations between June and October 1943. They compared losses in formations that had implemented full acoustic discipline protocols against formations with partial or minimal implementation. The analysis controlled for escort strength, air cover availability, route selection, and known U-boat deployments. The results, while not definitive, showed measurable differences. Convoys with strict acoustic discipline experienced 23% fewer initial U-boat contacts than comparable convoys with minimal implementation. When contact occurred, attacks developed into successful engagements 29% less often in acoustically disciplined formations. These weren't dramatic improvements. Acoustic discipline wasn't a decisive countermeasure like radar or escort carriers, but in the brutal mathematics of Atlantic convoy operations, where losses accumulated ship by ship, reducing contact probability by 23% translated to dozens of ships and thousands of lives over a year's operations. The statistical analysis remained classified. Public acknowledgement would have revealed that Allied command knew U-boats relied heavily on hydrophone detection, which might have compromised ultra-intelligence. But within the operational community, acoustic discipline became standard practice. By November 1943, essentially all Atlantic convoys operated under randomized schedules with noise reduction protocols. Merchant sailors still complained about extra work. Galley crews still resented wrapping utensils and padding surfaces. But compliance became routine, incorporated into standard procedures alongside blackout discipline and lifeboat drills. The broader context during this period was the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. May 1943, the same month the Admiralty issued acoustic discipline protocols, saw the highest U-boat losses of the war. 41 submarines were destroyed that month, forcing Dönitz to temporarily withdraw from the North Atlantic. The combination of escort carriers, improved radar, long-range aircraft, tactical evolution, and acoustic discipline had shifted the balance decisively against U-boats. Merchant ship losses, which had peaked at nearly 700,000 tons in November 1942, declined dramatically. By September 1943, monthly losses had dropped below 100,000 tons. The Atlantic supply line, which had appeared on the verge of collapse in early 1943, stabilized and strengthened. The buildup for eventual invasion of Europe became logistically feasible because convoys were getting through. Acoustic discipline played a supporting role in this transformation. But supporting roles matter when the difference between success and failure measures in percentage points accumulated across hundreds of convoy crossings. Harold Berkowitz knew none of this detailed analysis. He continued serving as ship's cook aboard the Thomas Hartley, making 5 more Atlantic crossings between May and December 1943. He wrapped cooking utensils in cloth, padded galley surfaces with foam rubber, and timed meal preparation according to randomized schedules transmitted by convoy commodores. He never received official recognition for his proposal. The Admiralty memorandum that implemented his ideas didn't mention his name. What he did receive was different validation. In September 1943, after the Thomas Hartley completed its 6th Atlantic crossing, Captain Threlkeld called Berkowitz to his cabin. "I thought you'd want to know," Threlkeld said, "that the Admiralty's acoustic discipline protocols are now mandatory across all convoy operations. Your proposal was the first practical suggestion for implementing these measures on merchant vessels. It took initiative to submit it and courage to keep pushing after initial rejection." "Did it actually help, sir?" Berkowitz asked. "The convoys are getting through," Threlkeld replied. "Whether your specific measures made the difference, we'll probably never know for certain. But every small advantage matters out here. You identified something nobody else was paying attention to. That's worth recognizing." Threlkeld handed Berkowitz a letter of commendation, noting his initiative and tactical insight in developing operational protocols that enhanced convoy security. It wasn't a medal. It wouldn't make any difference to Berkowitz's pay or rank. But it was formal acknowledgement that his idea, initially dismissed as paranoid and impractical, had been implemented fleet-wide. Berkowitz kept that letter in his sea bag for the rest of the war. Stories like these reveal the complexity behind the headlines. If you think this level of detail matters, hit subscribe and leave a comment with your thoughts. Understanding the full impact of acoustic discipline requires examining the perspective from inside U-boats, where hydrophone operators experienced the changes directly. Oskar Fleischer, the petty officer who'd first reported irregular patterns in April 1943, survived the war and was interviewed extensively by Allied naval intelligence in 1946. His testimony, preserved in British Admiralty archives, provides detailed insight into how acoustic discipline affected U-boat operations. Fleischer had trained as a hydrophone operator in 1941 at the Kriegsmarine's Acoustic Warfare School in Neustadt. The training emphasized pattern recognition. Instructors played recordings of various ship types, teaching operators to identify vessels by their acoustic signatures. Propeller designs created distinctive sounds. Engine types produced characteristic rhythms. Even hull configurations affected how sound propagated. You learned to hear the difference between a destroyer and a freighter within seconds, Fleischer explained in his 1946 interview. Destroyers had higher-pitched propeller sounds, faster rotation rates, more aggressive maneuvering. Freighters were lower, steadier, more predictable. In a convoy, you could count individual ships by tracking separate propeller signatures. But Fleischer also learned to detect secondary acoustic signatures. Convoys created complex sound environments. Beyond propulsion noise, hydrophones picked up cargo shifting, hull creaking, deck operations, and what Fleischer called routine rhythms, the predictable patterns of crew activities. On long patrols, you spent hours listening to convoys transit overhead, he recalled. You learned their schedules. Every 4 hours, activity increased, watch changes, meal preparations. You'd hear metallic sounds from multiple ships simultaneously. Coal being loaded into stoves. Pots clanging. These sounds helped confirm convoy composition. If you heard synchronized galley operations from 15 or 20 sources, you knew you'd detected a major formation, not just a few independent merchants. This testimony confirmed exactly what Berkowitz had intuited. U-boat hydrophone operators used galley sounds as tactical intelligence. Fleischer described how this changed during summer and autumn 1943. The rhythms became irregular. Instead of synchronized activity across the convoy, each ship seemed to operate on individual schedules. The pattern recognition we'd trained on became unreliable. You'd still hear the primary propeller sounds, but the secondary signatures were randomized. This made it harder to determine convoy size and structure with confidence. The operational impact was subtle but significant. U-boat commanders relied on hydrophone operators to provide targeting information before committing to attacks. Knowing whether they faced a 30-ship convoy with light escort or a 15-ship convoy with heavy escort affected tactical decisions. Uncertainty about convoy composition made commanders more cautious. When you couldn't determine the convoy's size from acoustic analysis, Fleischer explained, you had to get closer for visual confirmation. That increased risk. Periscope observations could be detected by escorts. Surface reconnaissance exposed you to aircraft. The safest approach was identifying targets from maximum hydrophone range, then positioning for attack based on that information. When the acoustic intelligence became unreliable, the entire process became more dangerous. Some U-boat commanders adapted by changing tactics. Instead of attempting precise positioning based on hydrophone analysis, they relied more on visual reconnaissance and radio coordination with other Wolfpack boats. This worked to some extent, but it increased exposure and reduced the element of surprise that hydrophone detection had provided. Other commanders became more aggressive, closing to confirm targets despite increased risk. This led to higher U-boat casualties. Escorts with ASDIC could detect submarines that approached within a few kilometers. Aircraft with radar could spot surfaced submarines attempting visual reconnaissance. The tactical advantage that passive hydrophone detection had provided, allowing submarines to track convoys from safe distances, diminished. Fleischer's testimony also revealed that German naval intelligence recognized the change. By autumn 1943, U-boat command was receiving reports from multiple boats describing altered acoustic patterns. Admiral Dernitz's staff conducted analysis and concluded that Allied convoys had implemented systematic acoustic discipline measures. German countermeasures focused on improved hydrophone technology and enhanced operator training. New equipment with better sensitivity was developed, though production delays meant few submarines received upgrades before the war ended. Training protocols were revised to help operators detect convoys despite irregular secondary signatures. Some commanders experimented with alternate tactics that reduced reliance on hydrophone detection. But these countermeasures couldn't fully compensate for the loss of acoustic intelligence. The combination of randomized schedules and noise reduction had successfully degraded a key German tactical advantage. U-boats remained dangerous throughout 1944 and into 1945. But every small degradation in their effectiveness contributed to the overall shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. By the time Fleischer surrendered in May 1945, he'd served on 3 different U-boats and completed 17 patrols. He'd experienced the evolution of convoy tactics from the hydrophone operator's position. His testimony provided Allied intelligence with detailed confirmation that acoustic discipline measures had achieved their intended effect. Did it win the war? Fleischer was asked during his interview. Obviously not. But did it make our job harder? Yes. Did it reduce our success rates? Probably. These things are difficult to measure in isolation, but from an operator's perspective, the change was noticeable. We lost an intelligence advantage we'd previously taken for granted. Chapter 6, Recognition and Legacy. Harold Berkowitz completed 12 Atlantic crossings before the war ended. The Thomas Hartley survived without being torpedoed, which made it one of the fortunate vessels in a merchant fleet that lost 5,000 ships during the war. He never became famous. No newspaper articles profiled the cook who'd suggested acoustic discipline measures. No official commendation ceremony recognized his contribution. The Admiralty memorandum that implemented his ideas remained classified for decades, and when finally declassified, it attributed the protocols to operational analysis without mentioning specific individuals. Berkowitz didn't particularly mind. He'd made his suggestion because it seemed like common sense based on what he'd experienced in a lifeboat listening to a U-boat hunt. The fact that it had been implemented was satisfaction enough. After the war, Berkowitz returned to civilian life in Philadelphia, where he opened a restaurant that operated successfully for 32 years. He rarely discussed his wartime service, except occasionally with other merchant marine veterans who understood what the Atlantic crossing had been like. When he did tell the story about acoustic discipline, he presented it matter-of-factly. "I noticed we were making noise that seemed unnecessary," he'd explain. "I suggested we stop doing that. They eventually agreed." That's the whole story. Captain Eugene Threlkeld, who'd forwarded Berkowitz's proposal up the chain of command, also survived the war. In his memoir, published privately in 1968, he devoted a chapter to innovations that had emerged from crew members rather than command staff. He described Berkowitz's acoustic discipline proposal as an example of how practical experience sometimes reveals tactical insights that escape formal analysis. Rear Admiral Edmund Vogel, the convoy commodore who'd authorized the experimental trial, received official recognition for his contributions to Atlantic convoy operations, though the citation made no specific reference to acoustic discipline protocols. After the war, he testified before naval review boards examining lessons learned from the Battle of the Atlantic. His testimony included discussion of acoustic discipline measures and their apparent effectiveness, though he acknowledged that isolating their specific contribution remained difficult. The broader legacy of acoustic discipline extended beyond World War II. Post-war naval design incorporated noise reduction as a standard consideration, particularly for submarines. The Cold War undersea competition between American and Soviet forces focused heavily on acoustic signatures and detection capabilities. Modern submarines invest enormous resources in minimizing their acoustic profiles, using technologies far more sophisticated than padding galley surfaces with foam rubber. But the fundamental principle remained the same. Sound in water reveals presence and identity. Controlling that sound provides tactical advantage. The insight that a merchant marine cook articulated in 1943, that even minor sources of noise could contribute to detection, became a foundational concept in naval operations. The story also demonstrates how innovation emerges from unexpected sources during wartime. Formal military hierarchies tend to value expertise and rank. Officers make decisions. Enlisted personnel execute them. Technical specialists develop new equipment and tactics. This structure has logic and efficiency, but it can also overlook insights that come from unusual perspectives. Berkowitz wasn't a naval architect or an acoustic engineer. He had no formal training in submarine warfare or hydrophone operations. He was a cook who'd happened to spend 4 hours in a lifeboat listening to a U-boat hunt survivors. That specific experience gave him perspective that formal training might not have provided. He understood, in a visceral way, that U-boats hunted by listening, and he recognized that routine shipboard operations might contribute to what they heard. The fact that his initial proposal was rejected illustrates how easily such insights can be dismissed. The executive officer who turned down the first version wasn't being unreasonable. From a traditional naval perspective, the idea that galley schedules affected submarine detection seemed far-fetched. Established protocols for acoustic discipline focused on major sources like machinery and propellers. Suggesting that cooking pots mattered seemed disproportionate. What changed the assessment was Berkowitz's persistence and supporting evidence from the HX-227 battle analysis. The Admiralty's own technical notes about sophisticated acoustic analysis provided context that made the proposal credible. The experimental trial, though inconclusive by itself, demonstrated feasibility, and ultimately ultra-intelligence confirming that U-boats had noticed irregular patterns validated the entire concept. This progression from individual insight to institutional implementation took months and required multiple points of advocacy. Berkowitz needed Captain Threlkeld to take the proposal seriously. Threlkeld needed Admiral Vogel to authorize testing. Vogel needed Admiralty analysts to recognize significance. Admiralty needed ultra-intelligence to confirm effectiveness. At each stage, the idea could have been dismissed or forgotten. That it ultimately became fleet-wide policy required both merit and fortunate timing. The statistical impact, as measured by operational research analysts, suggested that acoustic discipline reduced U-boat detection effectiveness by roughly 20 to 30% in formations that implemented full protocols. This wasn't decisive. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by cumulative advantages across multiple domains. Technology, intelligence, tactics, production capacity, human factors. No single measure determined the outcome. But cumulative advantages matter precisely because they accumulate. Reducing detection by 23% across hundreds of convoy crossings meant dozens of ships that reached port instead of being torpedoed. Those ships carried fuel, ammunition, food, vehicles, aircraft, all the materials that made the invasion of Europe possible. The lives saved, both merchant sailors and naval personnel, numbered in the thousands over the course of the war. Harold Berkowitz died in 1987 at age 73. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned his restaurant and his wartime service in the Merchant Marine. It made no reference to acoustic discipline protocols or tactical innovation. The handful of people who attended his funeral included family, friends, and a few fellow Merchant Marine veterans. None of them knew about the decrypted German messages confirming that his idea had worked. The historical record preserved his contribution in fragmentary form. The letter of commendation from Captain Threlkeld survived in his personal papers, donated to a maritime museum after his death. Admiralty records, declassified in the 1970s, documented the implementation of acoustic discipline protocols without naming their origin. Ultra-decrypts mentioning irregular acoustic patterns remained classified until the 1990s. Oskar Fleischer's testimony, given to Allied intelligence in 1946, was partially released in 2003. Assembling these fragments reveals a story that challenges simple narratives about wartime innovation. This wasn't a scientist developing breakthrough technology. It wasn't a commander making bold tactical decisions. It wasn't dramatic heroism under fire. It was a cook noticing something, suggesting a solution, persisting when initially dismissed, and eventually seeing the idea implemented across an entire fleet. The impact was real but difficult to measure. The recognition was minimal but sincere. The legacy extends into modern naval operations without most practitioners knowing the origin. In the broader history of the Battle of the Atlantic, acoustic discipline occupies a footnote. Standard histories focus on technological breakthroughs like radar and sonar, intelligence triumphs like breaking Enigma, tactical evolution like hunter-killer groups and escort carriers, industrial achievements like Liberty ship production. These elements deserve their prominence. They were decisive. But beneath the major narratives, thousands of smaller contributions accumulated to shift the balance. innovations in convoy routing, improvements in damage control procedures, refinements in lifeboat equipment, training protocols for new merchant crews, communication procedures between ships, weather forecasting for route planning. All of these mattered. All of these saved lives. Acoustic discipline belongs in that category. A practical measure proposed by someone with direct experience, implemented systematically, contributing incrementally to the larger outcome. Not glamorous, not dramatic, just effective enough to matter when applied across thousands of ship days at sea. The question Berkowitz asked himself in March 1943, standing in a dark galley thinking about what U-boats might be hearing, was fundamentally about taking the enemy's perspective seriously. What were they listening for? What patterns might they recognize? What could be changed to break those patterns? These weren't questions about technology or firepower. They were questions about behavior and procedure, about small details that create larger signatures. The fact that thoughtfulness, persistence, and practical insight could contribute to victory in a global conflict is worth remembering. Not every contribution to winning a war requires extraordinary heroism or technical genius. Sometimes it requires paying attention, thinking carefully, and being willing to suggest ideas that might seem minor but address real problems. Harold Berkowitz did exactly that. The underwater war was fought by hydrophone operators and ASDIC technicians, by submarine commanders and escort captains, by cryptanalysts and intelligence officers. But it was also fought by thousands of merchant sailors who implemented procedures, maintained discipline, and accepted risks while hauling cargo across an ocean filled with predators. One of those merchant sailors happened to notice that galley pots made noise. He suggested reducing that noise. The suggestion eventually became policy. U-boats noticed the change. Statistical analysis suggested it helped. Ships got through. Materials reached Britain. The invasion of Europe became possible. Accounts like this deserve to be remembered. If you think so too, leave a comment and hit like for more untold stories from World War II.